intervened on behalf
Well, it was in my childhood days. Oh Lord, many long years ago.
Good evening, saints and sinners. I am the Reverend Reginald Cephas Weaver III of the New Jerusalem Missionary Church of God, and I am here to warn you that the end is coming. Turn a button, but don't turn that dial. A reckoning is on its way, and right yet soon, as the judgment comes like a thief in the night. I plead that y'all hearken for your soul's sake to kindle a fire in your heart today, so that the rest of you don't burn tomorrow. From WXTN AM, I bid you all a most blessed welcome to the Judgment Night Radio Hour.
In that little, that one church house, out on a hill.
From a little church up on a high hill, right off a dirt road, just on the outskirts of eternity, I speak here on this most sacred of evenings. For indeed all evenings are sacred, as all souls may care to give their account before that great white throne, to see to it that you are most mindful of that flame toward penitence. For you know full well that the day of the Lord comes like a thief in the night. If you have found yourself here tonight, I bid you count it a blessing from Providence, mysterious and merciful Providence. We turn our eyes and our ears and, yes, therefore, our wicked hearts away from it daily and nightly, out of our fear of the light. But whither we go on our last day, we surely shall not escape from it. I pray you glean this from our message this evening. In the word I give you tonight, I'm going to tell you about a man. Yes, a man who was unlike any man, but in his own way, afflicted as all men, whether they care to see their affliction or not. Open your hearts, and ye who all have ears, do hear the good word tonight about the mad blood. They had said the fellow had what they had then begun to call mad blood, they being all who watched and whispered, huddled so close in their sharp and whisper muttering that surely a spirit brewed, firstly on account of the flailing. See, he, the boy, the man, he was old enough to be called a man, would wriggle gaunt, taut arms at the black blue sky, with his fingertips grabbing reddened palms like he was clutching to climb up to heaven. And maybe he was. Indeed, some of the folks who called what he had the mad blood surmised he was afflicted with it after just such cause. A righteous recompense whipped on his back for struggling to enter the kingdom on his own steam, from only the grimy sweat from his own hands and brow, like the builders at Babel. Bailey was not 22 years old when he first hollered at a blood-red moon and shivered like a snake bit him on his insides. Old enough to be a man. Old enough to have found a pretty wife and sire 2 rowdy sons and a baby girl. Turns of phrase, when left unwatched, don't take much time to set, and when they do indeed. Mad blood set in quick and hard, like fine aged earth, molten, baked, and cooled. Suella, his long-suffering wife, called out to him those long early nights in that strained, crackled squeal that worried wives cry. On that first night she swallowed gasps, clasped her mouth, and then covered herself in the night chill. She didn't expect to stay out long when she got up and saw her husband's cool depression in the bed. She stumbled about in her husband's wringer, rubbing her eyes, and followed muffled screeches to the window at the end of the upstairs hallway. She hollered for her husband at first, when she saw the open window.
That you, Bailey?
He was outside. It was late fall. He was bare as a rooster and just as loud, brooding upon their splintery low roof. Head bowed as in worship, arms lifted and trembling as in praise, voice in flight and rumbling not at all unlike a naked man on a roof, howling up at his quiet God. She cussed him out something fierce at first, not trying to make out what he was saying at the moon. She didn't weep until she ran downstairs out the front door and looked up from their flat front yard, saw her husband perched and naked and calling in what might as well have been tongue. That was the first night she saw, but that was probably the second or third time Bailey had done it. She hadn't been the first to see him. When the gossip first bubbled about, the people in town were good enough in their manners not to let it come back to her. She ran back into the house, scuttled to their bed, her feet remembering to move so as to not to wake the children, scared like hell to touch her husband's dent, gasping and heaving into her palm, too confused to cry, but doing it anyway, and shuddered herself to sleep. There was no word of it the following morning. Bailey overslept so he didn't shave. His eyes were sunk and shadowed, but he didn't move or breathe, more wearied than usual. He was silent, save for a hearty cough and 2 throat clearings, and fixed himself a bowl of frosted flakes that he hardly touched before he shuffled out the door to head to work. He kissed her good morning. Suella praised God he didn't ask her about breakfast. She had huddled up and gripped her knees and waited till he had left for work, alone to pray. She asked Jesus that it be only a dream, but just as good as one. That was in October. It was a whole other week before Suella was willing to let her husband touch her again, which was just as well because it was that long before he tried. When she felt that tender creeping hand along her shoulder, she jolted, just slightly, enough so that he wouldn't catch it, swallowed hard and gripped a fist against her belly and pushed a sigh of relief out of her throat. She kept her eyes and jaws closed while he was inside her, and while they made love, she waited in vain, a most blessed vanity, for any kind of shift in his rhythm, a harshness in his grip, or even a lilt in his touch, perhaps a graying, mushy gentleness that didn't become him, but thankfully he only felt the same. And when they did it again, she let herself sigh for real, while he lay spent in her arms. After they were done, Suella stayed awake for an hour or 2, stroking her snoring husband's hair and ear, and marveled smirklessly and at the dark rather than the ceiling, Why, no neighbors said a word about all that surely damned ruckus from both she and Bailey that night she found him on the roof. A breezy Thursday night at the county fair, a cool Halloween, and a Thanksgiving later, Suella had convinced herself that she had forgotten it. Then a week after Thanksgiving, she rolled into that cool depression in the bed and slid awake, strewn hard to consciousness, when she saw boxers and a wife beater sprawled on the floor like their wearer had been raptured up just minutes ago. It was too cold to walk outside and just the ringer, and this time she heard a chorus of stray dogs behind his call. He was violently shivering, but he missed not a beat. In the chill, his breath was a visible stream, like he breathed fire. This time, Suella stood still as stone for a solid minute. Didn't want to donate any strength toward moving a muscle in her face. She listened. The noises she couldn't make out. There was a flow, a unity, which could not be chopped into anything she would recognize as words. But he wasn't singing. She raised an eyebrow when this clicked, wondered for more than a whole second, and then she stepped back inside. She didn't ask him what the hell he was doing up there. She just kept him wrapped in a ragged brown quilt and fixed him hot candles and coffee and orange juice and told him to stay in bed, softly but firmly, swallowing tenderness at the end of each sentence. Bailey's pneumonia lasted 3 weeks, only kept him from the plant for 4 days. She rubbed his shoulder and asked him if he needed anything and got him what he needed even when he said no. She kissed him on the temples without smiling and scrambled him eggs. Told Billy and Brendan not to run in and bother their daddy. Made sure against her prickling, burning better judgment that he nightly heard little Lila's giggles from far enough so that he wouldn't be contagious. Bailey laughed, a raspy laugh, following his first good swig of Jameson's when Suella let him get close to the liquor 2 weeks into his sickness. Then he sniffed hard and said,
Damn, nice and warm,
and gestured at his wife. She didn't take. He went back to sleep. His body was mended by Christmas Day. Suella hadn't found the strength to cry, and by this point she had kept so much in, packed bunching like dulled spikes in her chest and womb, that she was too strong to do it. She realized she was in it for the long haul somewhere. She had this thought, sitting on that modest couch.
I must really love him. I guess so.
Watching her husband rise bare against Lila's bare tummy. She didn't even sigh afterwards. And she's stuck with him ever since. It did not happen again until summer came. By then, word had gotten around. Not to everyone, but to enough people where Suella got the wrong kind of butterflies in her stomach, and she wanted to look away and chuckle politely hurt when she met folks from church or the boys' daycare at the supermarket. She didn't admit it to herself, not for months after she'd acquired a language for what it is she would be admitting, but she felt a prickle down her back, the muffled, gray, and vaguely heavy kind, like tiny, soggy, crawling knuckles from the bright eyes of the sisters at Chesterfield Church of Christ or at Dennett Bridge Baptist, and at the thought that she was in their haughty prayers. She hadn't said anything more to herself about it, so she didn't say anything to them, nor to her husband. Bailey continued as if unawares. Mutterings had not seeped to many husbands yet, so it would be a while before Bailey felt the same prickle from the eyes and crooked mouths of the fellows at the plant. But years later he would tell himself and others that he felt it coming. That is as likely to be true as anything else. These were the early nights when Suella wept. Bailey tossed and turned and huffed, bumped his wife from slumber, squirmed violently off his side of the bed. He seemed to roll off and land on his feet and swing upright like a liquid. He was gasping and rubbing hard at his elbows, scratching his arms, chafing his thighs together. Suella whispered,
"What's wrong, baby?"
more than twice, and Bailey just might have heard nothing. Then she cried out,
"Baby! Baby, what is it? Tell me what's wrong, baby."
And by then he was strutting down the hall, pulling his wife beater apart and off his chest as if his honor were offended. He did the same with his shorts and stretched, stomping bare-assed down the hall, sure and tall and toward the window. Suella wept loudly.
Oh, God, no!
And woke the children. Bailey had said nothing. Brendan crept out of his room and saw his mama scuttle off in her panties after his daddy, who was clad only in the shadow that spilled from the meeting of the corners of the hall and the moon. Bailey didn't distinguish between the strain of Suella pulling at his arm, her whole weight pulling back on a bicep to no avail, and the burning he felt simmering under his flesh that wouldn't be cooled till he inhaled summer air. Bailey twice pulled hard away from his wife, and that was enough to get him off her, and he just said, his voice cavernous and stilted with conviction,
"It's all right, baby,"
and lifted the window up with a jolt and crawled out to the roof. Suella sat thrown on her backside at the window and squealed her worried squeal, and Brendan wondered via widening little eyes and silence what Daddy was doing naked and while Mama was crying, and so opted wisely not to ask if he could go downstairs and get some apple juice, showing he had been raised well. This was the tail end of June. They couldn't afford any kind of shrink on Bailey's pay, he insisted. Suella knew better anyway. Suella was more angry than afraid this time. She didn't make breakfast, and Bailey asked why, having gotten up early enough to savor some frosted flakes he didn't want. Suella told him why. She didn't holler, but he could hear her, and he could see her arms folded hard, too close to her, flattening her chest, which was not easy to do.
"I don't know what it is that you're doing, but it has got to stop."
She gagged on the words and then wet heaved them out. She swallowed easy after saying them. Her eyes were wide open and moist, and her lips pursed and determined. Bailey looked away and grunted like a puppy. They consulted the pastor Roland L. Wilkes at Chesterfield. He was a sturdy, neckless, and serious man, eager to help. His grins were wide and varied and never-ending. He stared into Bailey and Suella with his jaw poked out, seeing not a couple, but one flesh, across that carefully carved walnut desk. Bailey's eyes were far away, and he was gripping his wife's hand. Suella cradled her husband's arm and studied after the good pastor's gaze patiently, not counting the long, cold seconds since she finished summarizing their situation. The pastor invocated his counsel with a clipped, and the 26th verse of the 14th chapter of the Gospel of John to himself under his breath. Then, to the man and wife, a recitation of Matthew chapter 12, the 28th and 29th verses. wherein Christ spoke of binding the strong man. Suella, the Lord bless her heart, nodded slowly at the words and the wisdom of the pastor, but her eyes did not follow. Bailey said and did nothing, and neither did his eyes. The pastor Wilkes spoke.
We have to get at the root.
And the last word plucked and boomed and rhymed with foot and thumped like one.
The center, where it's hiding, so we can judge what is hiding.
Pastor Wilkes asked Bailey how it started. Bailey shrugged without looking at anyone and grunted respectfully that he didn't know. The pastor crumpled his brow and searched for a second and asked Bailey instead to describe how it worked. And Bailey said, after silence,
I don't know. I feel it stinging. I feel like I'm asleep and awake at the same time. I guess it feels kind of like...
He hesitated in the presence of the minister and went forward still.
Like when you're drunk.
The pastor was good about it and nodded in understanding.
It isn't quite like that, but that's all I can think of that's like it. When you ain't quite there all the way, but you are, you're watching yourself. It's like that. I'm wide awake enough to know what's going on, but I feel like I'm about to sleep. Then I feel a sting, almost an itch, but it's on the inside under my skin, ain't nowhere to scratch. But it burns like, I don't know, maybe like rubbing alcohol, but real bad. Real bad and everywhere. There ain't nowhere to scratch or rub.
Does it feel like fire?
The pastor interjects.
No, it ain't like fire.
Bailey corrects, then continues.
I don't know how to get at the burning, so I take everything off my skin, everything. And it still burns, but it feels cool at the same time. So I got to run out and feel the air where it's cool.
Bailey stops because it feels odd to remember. Maybe he really didn't before now. Before he was forced to try.
Why the roof, Bailey? Why not just run on outside?
Asks the pastor. Bailey doesn't know. His wife grips his arm harder.
I've just got to be where it's cool,
says Bailey, and shrugs. The pastor arches an eyebrow and looks at the wife. Now her eyes are far away too. The quiet in the office felt heavy. Not like the good kind. Pastor Wilkes ate a sigh like a communion wafer and asked Bailey what it is he's yelling.
I don't remember,
Bailey said. The wife grips harder, even harder.
Do you even know what you're hollering, son?
I'll remember, opening my mouth.
What are you hollering, son?
It's kind of like I'm throwing up,
Bailey says, and he means it. He refuses to lock eyes.
Wells up in my stomach, my throat fills up, kind of like I done had the wind knocked out of me. I don't pay no attention to what comes out. I don't listen.
The good man of God hears this and nods in stalwart and professional compassion. Suella nods in return, says,
Well, Pastor?
With just her eyes. There's a silence. The word,
well,
gropes its way from the good pastor's lips, and then he continues.
This is a formidable spirit. I'll have to sit with y'all again, talk about everything that's going on. In your marriage, the home, maybe with the children.
The children are fine.
I just want to develop an understanding of everything going on with y'all at home.
There ain't nothing going on, Reverend.
I know you probably feel that way, Brother Bailey, but this behavior, it's an indication of something that's crept in from the enemy.
Ain't nothing going on in my house. Ain't nothing going on with my boys or my little girl. Ain't nothing going on with my wife. They ain't got nothing to do with this.
His wife stares dead at him, his profile, and is confused for a second at how easy it is to hold back tears that are trying to bubble up. His voice doesn't have to be raised at all to echo beneath everyone in the room.
Bailey, son, now I'm trying to help.
I do appreciate you, Reverend.
You can't tell me anything about what this thing is that's got a hold of you. You can't tell me what it is you say at the night sky. But you so awful sure that it's got nothing to do with how you choose to live in your everyday life, how you're handling your home.
Bailey caught hold of his eyes long enough to whip them back in direct line at Pastor Wilkes and said,
"Yes, sir."
Suella pleaded, and he did not look at her.
Baby, please. We have got to get to the bottom of this.
This ain't got nothing to do with y'all. Whatever this is, it's something. It's just got to do with me. Whatever it is you want to do, Reverend, it just needs to be with me. Now, Suella don't even need to come in here.
No, baby. I want to be in here. I need to be in here with you.
Now, son, if that's how you feel, I can understand,
proclaims the pastor. He is mostly watching them speak to one another. One flesh, the sharp curl of his lips, the new lilt of his eyelids, bespeak his being in deep prayer.
But let your wife be a part of this process at least.
Bailey considers this wisdom and looks at his wife one more time.
All right. What process?
You're going to have to take a good look at everything you're doing, son. You're going to have to consider your sins.
My sins?
Do you have any secret sins? Time will come regardless to have to own up and confess them. You can say so here. That's why you came here, to be in the presence of those who love you.
I ain't got no sins.
We've all sinned and come short of the glory, Brother Bailey.
I ain't done nothing special. My wife knows everything I do. I curse some, like to get drunk now and again.
Well, those can be addressed.
What are you trying to say, Reverend?
The wife pleads again.
He's not trying to say anything, baby. He just wants to see where this is coming from.
Nobody is accusing you of anything, Bailey.
All right. Well, what's this process you're talking about?
Don't you want to know?
Inquires the pastor, because he is sincerely curious.
Where in God's name this thing is coming from? Why else would you be in here?
Bailey grimaces, shrugs with his face.
For Suella, didn't want my wife to keep on worrying.
A swig of high life at the end of that afternoon was Bailey's dispassionate answer to the pastor's diagnosis, a demon spirit of some sort, and to the prescribed sessions in the pastor's office, weekly talks, confidential of course, for which the pastor all too generously scheduled special time, and attendance to the men's prayer meetings every Thursday night at 7:30. Bailey would sit slouched before the pastor Wilkes, even though Wilkes sat eye to eye across his desk as if to correct their equality with subservience. Bailey's right leg always shook non-stop during the session. For 3 months, Bailey sat in front of the pastor, praying long-winded prayers based on voices about casting out demons, and fumbling about with his head in his hands trying to recall and recount the lapses that week.
I think I said shit a couple times at work. The other day I got to staring at Miss Lattimore. That's the lady at the daycare, looks after my boys. A little longer than I reckon I'd ought to. But that don't mean at all that my wife don't do it for me, you know. Just as hard not to sneak a look, you know. And I think I had a bit too much drink at Gary's last Tuesday. I almost couldn't drive home. Like to beat the tar out of Mr. Carlson. That's one of the supervisors at the plant. I don't like that son of a gun. Nobody does.
The good pastor would comfort him and encourage him and commend him to keep watch over his sins, just like that. He would go to the prayer meetings and see stilted, weary, and blustery males, rumbling voices under quivering mustaches, and smile when he got a slap on the back or a limp handshake. He did like the quiet time, though. Suella watched her husband chafe at all that extra church. Just like when she first witnessed him on the roof, She wept the first night, but after that she didn't worry. Not for 3 whole months. Then it happened again. It must have been working, she told herself to think. Whatever dark germ that dug in and festered in Bailey's habits and little routine sins, staring at the babysitter's ass, or too much liquor, or talking too rough behind his boss man's back, must have accumulated, gathered in a black, rotting, Golgothan mound in some astral breakfront, and metastasized into this ungodly thing that burrowed in her husband's veins, airing out vice after vice, and sitting silent with other men of God and listening to the pastor's counsel.
Deliverance comes through constant resistance, brother.
Must finally be starving it. Whatever. She knew better, though. The next time was on the edge of autumn. A rough howl rippled through a neck full of noise. Suella looked on with no wind in her to weep. Only enough to wonder. She laid heavy against that cool depression that night, gripping a twilight sleep, waiting on a dream like St. Joseph. She waited until the pain of waiting drew her wide awake, and she lay there till she felt her husband return, and she shivered against his cooled flesh, curled her body at his arm's gentle slide across her waist, and her heartbeat still rattled sore while she melted into her husband, deeper into this strange man's embrace, and she watched herself rest there. Her mind was blank, and it still resisted her comfort, like resisting the flesh. She felt her husband's pulse on her back, and it was steady, and it echoed in her marrow, and it was easy, and it sounded like deep shots of breath. Her own heartbeat locked in rhythm. The angel Gabriel must have made it after all. The whisperings came sure and steady. They had never stopped. Bailey's sessions with Pastor Wilkes were confidential, but most of the congregation knew that he was going to see him, especially the sisters. This was likely due to the pastor's secretary, Lenora, as she frequently had to rearrange appointments on his calendar. Suella was all too used to strokes on her shoulder and glad hands and chipper smiles and sudden and frequent and empty offers for anything you need, honey, and unprovoked reassurances that she was being lifted up in prayer. She even got a lumpy key lime pie or a crusty casserole or two. The muttering and the spirit that was brewed, that could be traced back when Suella and Bailey tried to remember to when Eveline McCrae knocked on their door one Friday afternoon and slapped Bailey across the face once he answered the door, and then shuffled off in tears. Suella asked what that was all about, and Bailey, honest to God, had no idea. A month later, Eveline had run off and left her husband, Keith McCrae, from the local Chamber of Commerce, alone to his Jim Beam, and, according to more whispering, because there's always use for whispering, his 2 teenage mistresses. 2 nights after his wife left her, Keith knocked on her door and tried to break Bailey's nose for having called his wife a harlot and himself an adulterer, and Bailey swung back and didn't miss, and reassured Keith that he had done no such thing. The story made for a good laugh all November, and then nobody thought much of it again until Keith McCrae hanged himself 10 years later. But folks started saying Bailey had mad blood long before then. Pastor Wilkes would never say that he could not exorcise the spirit that took hold of Bailey. In prayer meetings and sermons, he would allude to the practice with a congregant of making one's sins known to oneself, not using any names, of course. But everyone knew. The sessions trailed off. Bailey would start missing days here and there after about 7 months steady. For the next 5 years, he would remain a fixture at men's prayer, even when it was moved to Wednesday nights, because he liked the quiet time. Years hence, even long after the family stopped going to Chesterfield, Bailey would still shake Wilkes's hand and thank him for showing him how to watch out for his sins. And Wilkes would offer big, vacant, almost frightened eyes and a tepid,
"I do appreciate it, son.
And,
God bless you."
See, the man, by then he was surely a man, continued to flail his arms at the moon at night. But he also watched his tongue and wasn't given to strong drink much once he hit age 30. Suella stayed pretty, but she showed her age and called her husband Bailey more than baby so much by those days. It was her job to explain to Brendan and Billy, once they turned 11, the noises on the roof. It was also her job to answer unexpected knocks at the door. This was decided between husband and wife not long after the weekend after New Year's in '83, when Deputy Marv Hurley from the Public Safety Office pounded on the door at 2:30 in the morning, coked up and nose bleeding, screaming, his face blood red and soaked in tears, shivering, demanding Bailey to apologize for having cost him his job. The incident woke Lila up and made her cry, and both parents had to sing her to sleep. There were 2 more altercations like this outside the home, one in the summer of '84 at Gary's, when Tucker Adams swung a bottle of Black Label across the back of Bailey's head, and Bailey came back swinging, and both of them wound up with more stitches than they could afford to pay for, on account of Tucker's claim that Bailey had outed his having knocked up their supervisor's 16-year-old daughter Chesley. Bailey knocked out 2 of Tucker's teeth and said he did no such thing. Brendan and Billy saw a lot of trouble starting about middle school, trying hard not to wear their daddy's reputation on their sleeves. It could not be avoided. By that time, their household had no visitors. Oily fingers pointed toward their house, peeling as if from a lack of eyes on it. "Leave them folks alone," rattled in the heads of neighborhood children. Mad blood was a term that circulated around grown folks, but the sentiment trickled down to the following generation, and the boys got kicked out of 2 or 3 middle schools in town for fighting. By the time Bailey saw 40 years old, he had been a supervisor at the plant for 7 years, and only the young men who commuted from out of town consulted his wisdom. They got to talking to the other men, and the women by those days, and that didn't last long either. Suella didn't smile so much anymore. She wore her hair down to her waist and her figure was gone, or that's what she thought. Bailey liked his wife's big hips and the wear on her eyes, and learned not to miss her smile so much. She, in turn, learned how to tend to worn joints and skin stretched by the elements. Bailey couldn't reach that roof as easily as he could those first autumn nights, and it made for more weeks of sickness that led to a coarse voice. He was even more soft-spoken than he was in his youth. The soles of his feet were scarred and leathery, his thighs and neck and elbows given to reddening. He peeled like the paint on their house. The roof was repatterned with foot dents. There were patches of paint over graffiti. and new windows that had been smashed through by neighbors or fellow congregants, her old friends. Whisperers. The first summer Lila came back from college to visit was when they first discussed moving away. Lila's suggestion, oddly enough. Lila was a pretty young woman, looked a lot like her mama back in the day, but with darker hair that she wore much, much shorter. Boys didn't talk to her in high school, whereas in college she managed to find herself a boyfriend, a tall, handsome, articulate black fella named Derek. Bailey liked his handshake and his eyes. She had plenty of friends and was looking to join in a sorority. In high school, most of the girls laughed at her on account of who her daddy was, or about Billy and Brendan's latest arrest, a DUI, a bar brawl, a paternity case.
There isn't anything here for y'all, Daddy. There never was.
It's, looking like you're right, baby girl, but it ain't quite ripe for us to leave yet.
Bailey prophesied to his daughter. They had all known him by his full name, Bailey Wilson McCrae Jr. They knew his father and his mother, Fanny. God rest both their souls. They knew his older sister, Carrie, and their younger brother, Fenton. They knew the pastor that he had grown up with at Dennett Bridge Baptist Church. They knew the name of the midwife who delivered him. Among them were the ones who muttered in disapproval when he started going to his comely wife's church because they allowed so many colored folks. Among them were the ones who used to spank his and his older sister's bottoms when they would raise hell on the way to school, or if they ran about after the street lights shined and sent them on home. Among them were girls in high school who turned up their noses when he wooed a cute, clumsy flag girl named Suella Fitzpatrick and laughed something wicked when he knocked her up. Among them were the jocks Bailey would smoke dope with after school before dates with Suella, who would later become co-workers at the plant. But they had not known him, for they had departed from him. Bailey and Suella drove to their daughter's college graduation and barely had the gas to come back home. When they did, they were tired. They missed their little girl and stayed with her all day. It was late when they decided to drive back home. Once they arrived, they shuffled their way to their bedroom and didn't even bother getting undressed. They both lied down and drifted off and let the darkness soothe them. And Suella squirmed awake for the 100th upon 100th time. She didn't flinch when she felt the depression in her bed in the middle of the night. She lifted a heavy head and heavier eyelids to see the sprawl of clothes on the floor. But they weren't there. She got up, walked the path down the hallway where there would usually be spent bedclothes, and saw the window still shut. She stepped downstairs and saw the front door open instead. The spring breeze wasn't so chilling that night. She saw her husband on the porch, stroking his throat, embedded in a red wooden chair. Only his feet were naked. He did not flail or wail, and his arms were not outstretched. But his eyes did follow the moon.
Baby?
She said, probably for the first time in nearly a decade.
What's wrong, baby?
The plant shut down 2 years before Lila's college graduation. Bailey had retired a year before that. Gary's had been closed for years, but he didn't really drink anymore anyways. There was no work in this town anymore. Suella prayed every night with her husband. But the last time the McCraes had set foot inside a church in town was at Suella's brother's wedding 8 years ago at Chesterfield, and they had stopped going there for 5 years at the time. Roland Wilkes was no longer the pastor. He did not join the Whisperers, but he had left to pastor a church a few counties away. Whispers said that it was on account of his secretary, who had stopped working and attending the church a few months before, then come back a year later with a pretty little baby named Claire. The McCraes stopped hearing those whispers after a while, even while everyone in town listened. There was nothing to do but withdraw. That McCrae boy has got some kind of evil in him. I mean, straight from the pit of hell. They all said it. They all had every reason to believe it. Bailey never was able to tell Pastor Wilkes what it was he was yelling, but everyone else in that town could. Bailey stood up atop his roof, exposed to the world in whatever sense one cared to pay note to, and regurgitated a noise to the night till the underside of his skin didn't burn anymore. And then he was comforted. As long as no one else was, he scratched at himself and headed toward that roof he took to staying in that house with his family to avoid run-ins with folks who heard him, howling at his quiet God. He swallowed hard with his tongue of fire and was content not to hear a word.
Ain't nothing wrong, baby,
he said to his wife that night.
I reckon it's time we left.
It was by all means a practical decision. No reason to be the pariah anymore. Suella and Bailey found a nice house in the next county. Got Billy and Brendan to help them move. They found a nice Methodist church there that they started going to. Somewhere where no one kept them lifted up. Suella smiled again. Folks still talked about the mad blood back home, even a few years after Bailey left. Still threw rocks at the old house. Still whispered. Still kept up hearty prayer. Still sinned. There was nothing else to do in that time. And when the sky finally fell one day and flood waters stood tall to cleanse that town of its callousness, they remembered as they gasped for breath those shrill cries at the crimson moon. And they remembered the ones that heard words, real words. But it was too late to repent by then. Plead again, brothers and sisters. Don't you tarry on your own repentance. Your sin will follow you, and you'll reap what you sow. I pray you were blessed or convicted by the sermon this evening. Many of those, like Brother Bailey and his long-suffering wife Suella, and the so-called whisperers walk amongst us, and I have no doubt are amongst you listeners out there. Which one, I ask, are you? You'll know soon enough when the judgment comes. I pray again for your soul's sake, you will bless us with your presence next time, and lend your heart and your ears. Join us next evening, if the good Lord wills it, and the creek don't rise. From WXTN AM, this is Reverend Reginald Cephas Weaver III of the New Jerusalem Missionary Church of God, telling you beware and be wary.
Church house out on a hill.
Thanks for listening to the Judgment Night Radio Hour. The Judgment Night Radio Hour is produced by Skyler Q. Andrews and Samuel W. Ellis, and stars Skyler Q. Andrews as the voice of Reverend Reginald Cephas Weaver III. This first episode featured the short story Mad Blood by Skyler Q. Andrews and directed by Skyler Q. Andrews and Samuel W. Ellis. Tonight's episode featured the voices of P.M. Rogers as Bailey McCrae Jr., Jennifer Sparling as Suella McCrae and Lila McCrae, and Richard E. Adams Jr. as Pastor Roland L. Wilkes. The music in tonight's episode included the song Lost Satellite Seeks Home by Studio Noir, featured with a reversal, and used with an attribution non-commercial share-alike license. To support our show on Patreon, visit www.patreon.com/judgmentnightradio. If you like our show, please don't forget to rate and review us on iTunes, which helps more people discover our show. And feel free to listen to us wherever you enjoy podcasts, including Google Play, Stitcher, and TuneIn. Contact us at judgmentnightradio@gmail.com. You can find us on Twitter at twitter.com/jnightradio, on Facebook at facebook.com/judgmentnightradio, and visit our website at www.judgmentnightradio.com.